Imagine someone offered you a free, practically undefined stay at a five-star hotel in Times Square in New York, which costs $500 per night. Imagine they offered 3 meals per day, working Wi-Fi, and to boot, a television. What would you do? Would you be grateful? Would you have gratitude? Well, the migrants invading New York City clearly aren't. Disturbing reports show that migrants who have been put up in these hotels have refused to eat the food they are given because it doesn't fit their cultural tastes. And they trashed the lobby of the hotel they stayed in. The lobby was littered with trash and beer bottles. Now, do these sound like migrants who are grateful to be in the good old USA, or do they sound like the worst type of people? People who are given so much but care very little about respecting those who are helping them. It's so sad that New York leaders continue to allow this to happen at the expense of their own people. Americans last, migrants first. Welcome to this Saturday broadcast. Today, we post a very special guest who comes from a very prestigious family. His uncle was a beloved president. His father was an attorney general, and he ran for president. Both were assassinated. He has serious ideas for a very serious time in our history. Let me welcome today, the son of Robert F. Kennedy Sr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Welcome to the broadcast.
Very happy to be here with you, Armstrong. Thanks for having me.
Your mother, 95-year-old Ethel Kennedy, is still alive?
Yeah, she is. She's actually right next door right now.
What a blessing.
Yeah, it is a blessing. She's had an amazing life, and she's a larger-than-life character and an extraordinary character. And she has great humor, and she's a wonderful storyteller, and she's beloved by our whole family.
Is there so much pressure when you think about the fact that you, as a Kennedy, when you think about your uncles and your relatives and what has happened to the Klan, and here you are today running for president of the United States, so much has changed. What kind of burden, what kind of opportunity does that present for you that comes from such political royalty?
Well, I never looked at it as a burden. I think it's I experience it as a privilege. I feel like a very lucky person to have been born into our family. We were taught from when we were little, we all grew up with the idea that our lives would be consumed by some great controversy, and that it would be a great privilege for us to play some role in it, and that the fact that I grew up in this family just gives me a whole retinue of access and other privileges that that allow me to have had a very, very rich life. So I'm very, it hasn't always been, it's like everything in life, Armstrong. We all take our licks, and life is a mix of tragedy and struggle, and hopefully we can hopefully we can treat pain as a touchstone for spiritual growth, and that we can take those, those times that are painful, those crisis times in our life, and turn that pain transform it into an opportunity for wisdom. The word wisdom means a knowledge of God's will, a knowledge of right and wrong, an instinct for right and wrong. And, we're all on different paths, but our path ultimately is toward God and toward light. And whatever that means to each of us, we have to figure it out for ourselves. And, I've been lucky enough to have a life that is filled with those opportunities for growth, but also filled with a lot of fun and a lot of richness.
I'm so happy you talked about transformation and growth. I was just reading some of the things you said in the past, and whatever you said about Ronald Reagan and 9/11, Hugo Chavez, and your family, what you may have said about vaccines and children and autism. I want to give you a chance at the beginning of this broadcast to show how you've evolved in your understanding, your thinking, and where you are today on these issues versus the Robert F. Kennedy of yesterday.
Well, okay, well, I don't know. I mean, why don't we talk about it issue by issue? What are you interested in?
So let's just start with, some people don't understand with the autism and vaccinations, but obviously the media loves sound bites, and they don't really give a person the full context to explain their position. So in terms of autism, kids being vaccinated and autism is brought about, talk about and discuss that with our audience so you can give us a clear understanding where you are and when it relates to the vaccines and your comments that it's continued to play in the press on the issue of autism.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of vaccines, my position has always been misstated in the press. I've never been anti-vaccine. I'm called anti-vax. But all I've said is that we should have the same testing protocols for vaccines that we give to other medicines, which means placebo-controlled trials prior to licensure. And unfortunately, vaccines are exempt from those. And so, without those kind of tests, we cannot tell whether that product is going to avert more problems than it's causing. And, the vaccine schedule has increased dramatically because they're very, very profitable. So we've gone from having 3 vaccines when I was little to having 72 doses of 16 vaccines for children today, for my kids' generation. And none of those vaccines has ever been tested prior to getting their license in a placebo-controlled trial. And many of those vaccines are for illnesses that are not casually contagious. For example, the hepatitis B vaccine, where kids are given 4 or 5 of those doses. The first one while they're still in the hospital. And that's a disease that is spread mainly through sexual transmission and through intravenous drug use. And so we really need to understand its impacts on a baby, who has zero risk for that disease. And yet we've never done that kind of testing. And when the year that we changed the vaccine schedule dramatically began around 1989. And that year we saw a tremendous growth in chronic disease in this country. By chronic disease, I mean neurological diseases like ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, and autism. We also saw explosions suddenly of peanut allergies and other food allergies. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I had 11 siblings and probably around 70 first cousins. And nobody had a peanut allergy. So why do 5 of my 7 kids have allergies? Well, that's a question that, we should be able to answer. The asthma exploded that year. My little brother had asthma. He was told by a doctor that this disease is they will never have a cure for it because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. Well, today, 1 out of every 4 Black children in urban areas has asthma. So what happened? The third category is autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis and juvenile diabetes, Crohn's disease, lupus, and 100 other autoimmune diseases that suddenly exploded around 1989. Oh, with autism, we went from having, in my generation, 1 in every 10,000 people my age has full-blown autism, full-blown. And that means nonverbal, non-toilet trained, head banging, violent, stimming, toe walking, hand flapping. You don't see people like that my age, but in my kids' generation, it's 1 in 34. So we went from having 1 in, 2,000 or 3,000, 1 in 10,000 for people my age, to 1 in 34 my kids' age. So what happened? So, somebody needs to answer that question. We know that Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. EPA came back and said 1989. It's a red line. So something happened in 1989. Well, there's a famous toxic. We know this isn't, it has to be an environmental exposure because genes don't cause epidemics. Genes can provide a vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. So there's a very famous toxicologist named Phil Landrigan that I've brought over 500 lawsuits, including some of the most important lawsuits on environmental and toxicology issues in the last 30 years, including the Monsanto case and many, many others. And there's a toxicologist that we've used on many of these cases named Phil Landrigan in New York at Mount Sinai. And Phil Landrigan has done a series of papers saying, okay, what was it? What are the possibilities that follow that timeline? And one of those is neonicotinoid pesticides, which exploded that year. Another is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient of Roundup, which exploded that year. You need to find a toxic exposure that affected is ubiquitous. It affected every demographic in this country, from Cubans in Key Biscayne, Miami, to Inuit in Alaska. Everybody was touched that year. So what could it be? Well, those are two, neonicotinoids and glyphosate. PFOAs, which is a flame retardant, which was put around that era in children's pajamas and in all of our furniture. Oh, we all have exposures. It's now in almost every big municipal water supply in this country. And now I was involved in the lawsuit on PFOAs as well, a number of lawsuits. Atrazine, which is another pesticide that is in about 63% of our water supply.
I do find it I find it fascinating how one issue leads to another. Obviously, this is something that you're very passionate about and done your research on. And I'm just so happy that you were able to put it in your context and not in a soundbite. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's a Democratic candidate for President of the United States, is our guest for the full hour. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. Inflation has been a persistent problem since 2020, and it hit a high of 9.1% in June of 2022. And although it has come down significantly from then, today the core inflation rate started to creep up again from 3% last month to 3.2% this month. Mr. Kennedy, what caused this inflation? Whose fault is it? And as president, what specific policies would you undertake to make sure we don't have it again?
Well, the fault can be attributed to a whole string of presidents and Congress people who have continued to fund things that we don't have the money to pay, and especially wars. We've spent $8 trillion on wars, on useless wars, since 2002. Just an illustration of that, the Iraq War, which was the first of these wars, and all the other ones came out of it, except now the Ukraine, which is its own issue, but the same people started it. It's the neocons in the White House, Victoria Nuland and Robert Kagan and Anthony Blinken and Avril Haines, and these are the people that are driving the warfare state. And the Iraq War cost, and its aftermath, the wars in Syria, Yemen, Libya, etc., Pakistan, Afghanistan, cost us $8 trillion. And here's what we got for it. Iraq is now worse off than we found it. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We killed between 600,000 and 1 million Iraqis. We drove Iraq into a proxy posture with Iran, which is the exact foreign policy outcome that we've been trying to avoid for 40 years. Iraq today is this incoherent state that is just a battle between Shia and Sunni death squads. We created ISIS and then went to war in Syria against ISIS and drove 2 million refugees, and again, another useless war and failed war. And we drove 2 million refugees up into Europe, which destabilized all the democracies in Europe for the next generations. That led to Brexit, to the exit of Britain from the EU, and it also directly led to the riots that you're seeing in France today. So that's what we got for $8 trillion. Well, what did it cost? It cost every American family. And, Congress doesn't come and say, we're going to spend $8 trillion on failed wars. They're too scared to do that. So what they do is they just go to war, or the president does it, and then they print money. And when you print money, it causes inflation. So we spend $8 trillion on that. We spent $16 trillion on the COVID lockdowns.
You mentioned as we speak about these wars, you said some time ago that Russia invaded Ukraine in good faith, and that the United States.
I did not.
Okay, please correct that. Correct that.
That's not what I said. Here's what I said.
Okay.
I said, the comic book picture that we were given by our political leadership, by the White House, that this was an unprovoked invasion by a very overly ambitious Vladimir Putin trying to reestablish the Russian Empire, is wrong. And I'm not making an excuse for Vladimir Putin. He did not need to go into Ukraine, and his invasion was illegal and brutal. But we have to understand that we provoked it. And we've been provoking it. The same people in the White House that I mentioned before, they call themselves the neocons, wanted this war with Russia. They wanted, and I'll give you a background, Armstrong. In 1992, the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev came to President Bush and Tony Blair and said, look, I'm going to dismantle the Soviet Union, and I'm going to remove 400,000 troops from East Germany. And I'm going to let NATO unify Germany. He was letting NATO move in a hostile army, move into Germany and replace his 400,000 troops. He said, I'll do that, but the one commitment I want from you is that you will not move NATO to the east. And James Baker, who was at that time the Secretary of State, famously said to Gorbachev, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, what happened in 1997, the neocons started taking over, and they said, we're going to move NATO right up to the Russian border. And between now and then, they've moved it into not only 1 inch, but 1,000 miles to the east in 14 nations. We've also put Aegis missile systems, which are nuclear capable, in Poland and Romania, which are 12 minutes from Moscow. So we could decapitate the Soviet leadership in 12 minutes. And we walked away from the 2 nuclear treaties that we had signed with the Soviet that forbade intermediate nuclear weapons. So, when the Russians put missiles in Cuba in 1962, my uncle was going to be forced to invade Cuba because they're too close. Well, guess what? We're doing the exact same thing to the Russians. And the real reason Russia puts them in Cuba in 1962 is because we had put Jupiter missile systems in Turkey. And the Russians said, that's a red line for us. If you put them next to us, we're going to put them next to you.
Let me raise this with you, Mr. Kennedy.
So, but let me just finish this, because to answer your question, and I'll be very brief. The Russians said Ukraine is a red line. We helped to overthrow the government of the Ukraine, a democratically elected government in 2014, and we put in a pro-Western government. At that point, Putin says, well, I'm going to go in there if you don't, because I'm scared you're going to take over my port in Vladivostok, the only, in Crimea, the only warm water port. But he proposes a peace agreement, which the British or the Germans agreed to and the French agreed to, called the Minsk Accords, which was going to leave Ukraine intact. And we would not, and Zelensky runs in 2019 on the base and wins 70% of the vote as a peace candidate, saying, if I'm elected, I'm going to sign the Minsk Accords. That would have settled the whole thing. Well, what happened? We went over there and told him he couldn't sign it because we wanted the war with Russia. Then Russia puts in 40,000 troops. They clearly do not want to take over the country. There's 3.5 million people in Kiev. They're not going to take over with 40,000 troops, but they wanted us back at the negotiating table. Zelensky goes back to the negotiating table in March of 2022. They ink an agreement. They both initial it, and an agreement to settle the whole war based upon the Minsk Accords. And what happens? Russia, in good faith, and this is where I use that phrase, began removing all of its troops from Ukraine. What happened? Joe Biden sent Boris Yeltsin to Kiev to torpedo that agreement because we wanted the war. So since then,
it's clear to you that America wants this war. That is,
America doesn't want this war. Listen, my son was over there fighting. My son went and joined the special forces over there, joined the Foreign Legion. He fought in the Kharkiv offensive. Americans believe what our leaders tell us, which is that this was an unprovoked invasion. But our leaders were not telling us the truth. And now that is all coming out. That agreement in March 2022, the public didn't know about that until 2 months ago, that we torpedoed that agreement. We should be outraged because this war is really about the U.S. determination to put our troops and our missiles on Russia's border, something that we would not tolerate if they did that to us.
Mr. Kennedy, hold that point. Robert Kennedy Jr. is our guest. He's a candidate for President of the United States. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. Does it surprise you that Hunter Biden has not been indicted?
I have not been focusing on Hunter Biden. What I've heard about it, if it's true, it would be very disturbing if, I've heard some of the testimony of the IRS agents that say that they were told to hold off on the investigation until after the statute of limitations had expired. If that's true, it would be enormously disturbing.
You think the president is being transparent about what he knew about his son's financial dealings and the money that was wired to his son's account?
I don't know. I would have no way of knowing that. I just would have no way of knowing, so I wouldn't comment on it.
Why do you think there's such disdain among the Democratic establishment that you're running?
I think for a lot of reasons. I think that there's the Democratic Party is really driven by a fear of Donald Trump. It's an odd situation where you have a presidential candidate and a former president who actually is responsible for crafting the central platforms of both political parties. Because the Democrats are so focused on beating Donald Trump, and they believe at this point that President Biden is the best way to do that. So it is the only real reliable path for doing that. I think that's part of it. And then another is that, there are factions that are running now the DNC that are very pro-war and that are very pro-pharma. And I'm a threat to those models, and that are very pro Wall Street. Oh, the Democratic Party has, when I was growing up, was the party of the poor and it was the party of the middle class. But now 70% of the wealth in our country is in the hands of the Democrats and 30% in the hands of Republicans.
Wow.
And of the 10 richest counties in America, 9 of them are Democratic. So we now have the inverse of the party that I grew up with, where the Democratic Party was the party of the working class, the middle class, and the poor. Today, that's switched over to the Republican Party, and it's a very, it's an interesting from a historical perspective. But anytime you get a transition like this, there's tremendous you call inertia, but it really violence against anybody who tries to change it. And I think I'm a threat to that model. I want to say one thing, Armstrong. The Iraq war has now cost us $113 billion. And that's what our commitment is. And Biden's going to Congress to ask for more money this week. Well, in March, we tapped that off to $113 billion. I have one of my best friends who's a commercial fisherman. He's on full disability and he gets food stamps. He gets $283 a month. And that, because of the inflation that you mentioned, has decreased. The value of those food stamps has decreased by 38% because in 2 years we've had 38% inflation. But basic foodstuffs like dairy, eggs, and chicken have actually increased by 76%. So his food stamps are buying 76% less than they were 2 years ago. And then in March 1st, he got a robocall from the government saying his food stamps were being cut to $23 a month, 90% cut. 30 million Americans got that call. 15 million Americans are being cut from Medicare. And the total cost of those programs for the year is $113 billion. So, and that same month, incidentally, the Fed printed $300 billion unanticipated to pay for the bailout of the Silicon Valley Bank. So we have a lot of money for bankers when they need it. And we have a lot of money for the war machine. When it comes to everyday Americans, we're starving them to death.
Speaking of everyday Americans, I spoke earlier about the sanctuary cities, the hundreds of thousands of migrants in New York, they're in Washington, D.C., they're in San Francisco. How would your immigration policies be different from what we see now?
Okay, so I've been to the border. I've studied this issue carefully. And I want to say at the outset, a lot of people come to this issue from a xenophobic or hatred of immigrants or racism even. But I come from a different place, a place of compassion and trying to solve a problem for our country. I went to the border. I saw in 2 hours, I saw 300 people walk across the border. The first 110 were from Africa. And I thought I was going to see Central Americans and Latin Americans, but no. The second group, I interviewed everyone. They were from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. Most of them were from China. There was only 2 families the whole night that came from Latin America, one from Colombia, one from Peru. And none of them, those were the only 2 families that were making asylum claims. The other ones were coming, openly told us, we're coming because we want to make money in the United States. So, and the Mexican drug cartels were driving them in buses up to the border, charge them $10,000 to $15,000 a piece, and then rob them and abuse them, exploit them, rape them, beat them, etc. We heard horror stories. And except because we now have an open border, the cartels are literally running America's immigration policy. Those people came across the border. I watched the whole process for 3 days. They were given then airplane tickets to any place in the United States they want to go to by the DHS, paid for ultimately by FEMA, which is us. So, and there's 7 million of them that have come across in the last 3 years. Okay, so what happens to them when they get here? They're now, they're told, they're given a court date That is 7 years down because there are no asylum judges. So they're allowed to stay here then. They're told you can stay here for 7 years, but you're illegal. So what do? They have no leverage in employment. They cannot legally work. So the unscrupulous employers now have total power over them. They pay them $5 or $6 an hour, and that dampens the wages for every other American. And they are landing in cities like New York. 95,000 have landed in New York. New York is now thinking of turning Roosevelt Island into a migrant camp, and even parts of Central Park, according to Bloomberg. So, and it's not, the last 20 years of his life, I worked pretty closely with Cesar Chavez. I was a pallbearer for him when he died. I had that honor. And I worked on pesticide issues, but he had two big issues. One of those issues was pesticides on farm workers, and the other issue was ending illegal immigration because he saw what it was doing to wages in the United States.
And many Americans, Mr. Kennedy, see this. How would you close the achievement, the educational gap, the crisis in education all across America? What would you do to make sure that kids could have a passport to the future by getting a quality education?
Let me just finish saying, because you asked me a question about how I would end it, and I'll tell you exactly how I'll end this border crisis. Everyone we talk to down there, the Border Patrol chiefs, the union members, the local law enforcement, the sheriffs, everybody we talk to said this is easily preventable. And there's two things that need to be done. One is you need barriers. You don't need to have a wall all the way 2,200 miles from Brownsville, Texas to San Diego, but you need some kind of monitoring system, which we had, and it was taken down. In the remote areas, motion sensors, video cameras, hours and lights, and so that you can see everybody who's coming across. You need physical barriers, which only have to be completed. I saw the big gaps in them. I think there's 20 gaps left. We just need to seal those. Most importantly, we need to hire enough asylum judges. And as soon as I get to the White House, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to seal this border. I'm going to have a humane, open immigration policy for people who are legally, doing it. And so that we can control it as a nation.
Well, you make a good point about the judges. I don't know if people realize there are only 88 immigration judges in the entire state of New York, and they would be amazed at how many are across the country. So you make a good point. What would you do about the education crisis?
Well, education is my main education and chronic disease in our children, which are two interconnected issues where, the chronic disease rate in our kids has gone from 6%. Today, it's probably around 60%. And, it doesn't matter what your education is. If you're going to be sick your whole life, which is what chronic disease does to you, it's going to be debilitating, and you're going to have your hope, your capacity to fulfill your destiny is now significantly diminished. So my two big promises are to end the chronic disease epidemic, and the other is to restore our education system by having the Federal Department of Education focus not on curriculum, but on actually providing infrastructure and making sure that teachers are getting decent pay so that we attract the best Americans to be teachers, that we support the ones who are there who are utterly unsupported today. We have teachers in this country that are buying their own school supplies or their classrooms. And, my wife recently went into she did a tour of the schools all over the country and in poor neighborhoods. She was in Detroit, and there was trash cans sitting in the middle of the classroom. She asked the teachers, why is that? And they said, because the roof leaks whenever it rains, that the fire alarms didn't work, the clocks didn't work. The children do not have proper equipment. They don't have computers, which they need. We are abandoning an entire generation of children. And guess what? If we weren't paying for these wars abroad, we would have plenty of money our children's abroad.
What are your
at home.
thoughts on
And,
school? What are your thoughts
we
on
are,
school choice and vouchers?
I'm for school choice, but I also understand that we cannot be cannibalizing our public schools. We need to figure out a way to do both. We need to make sure, and I think that's why the federal government has to get involved. We have to significantly cut our military expenses. We need to cut our expenditures on chronic disease so that we have that money to put into our school system. We are shackling an entire generation of children to a kind of slavery because we're not giving them the preparation they need to lead a fulfilling life, to be productive Americans. We're destroying this generation, and we cannot do that anymore.
Mr. Kennedy, when I come back, we have one segment left. I'm gonna tighten my questions. I want to get a lot in this last segment because its time is flying by. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is our guest. He's a Democratic candidate for President of the United States, and we'll be back. Mr. Kennedy, it's rapid response in this segment. What would you do about the just out of control crime and also to support law enforcement?
Well, I think you need to do both of those together. My father was the chief law enforcement officer of the land, and he was the Attorney General of the United States. And he tried to do two things that, one was that he was very, very tough on crime, which I'm going to be. But at the same time, for nonviolent offenses, and particularly drug offenses, I think imprisoning a quarter of our prison population is now nonviolent drug offenses, and that we ought to be offering those people rehabilitation opportunities, which is what I'm going to do. And, I think inside of our prisons, we need to do more to rehabilitate and retrain those populations so that they have opportunities to be productive citizens when they come out. We need to be tough on crime, but we also need to be providing opportunities for young people so that they don't join gangs.
Why are you, as a Democrat, challenging a sitting president who happens to be Democrat for the White House?
I think President Biden, who I've known for many, many years and have had a strong friendship with, that he's lost touch with the values of the Democratic Party, the values of the Kennedy and FDR and RFK Democrats. The Democrats have now turned into the pro-war party. We're in the pro-censorship party. We're the party of Wall Street. We're the party of the neocons. This very violent foreign policy. And I don't think it's serving our country. And I think it's really turned its back on America, on our democratic values.
How would you create a stronger middle class?
Number one, we need to start by reinvesting. The thing that's draining our middle class is the warfare state. We have 800 bases abroad where we were told in 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that we were going to get a peace dividend, that we were going to cut military expenditures from $600 billion a year to $200 billion, which was adequate to protect our country. Instead, we've raised it from $600 billion to $1.3 trillion. We spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. And, there's Paul Kennedy, who's no relationship to me, but he's a professor, a very famous professor at Yale, who's done an analysis of all of the empires of the past 500 years, and every one of them declined because they overextended their military abroad. China's doing exactly the opposite. China's doing what my Uncle John Kennedy tried to do, which is to protect economic power abroad rather than military power. And they are now, because of that, they're building all of it. The primary creditor in every nation in Latin America is now China, same in Africa. And they're sending engineers abroad. They're graduating 1.4 million engineers a year sending them abroad to build things, developing that infrastructure, developing that intellectual, that human infrastructure for their own country so that they're building a high-speed rail and everything else. And we've completely neglected our infrastructure. We've neglected, we've tried to run these countries and build relationships with the military, and it's not working. It's losing. And the Chinese are now eating our lunch abroad because of that. We used to graduate, Rice University alone used to graduate 20% of the engineers in the world. Today, it's less than 1%. We could not, if we go into those countries today to build roads, bridges, and ports, we don't know how to do it. We don't have the bench. We've spent $8 trillion bombing bridges, ports, roads, schools, and universities over the past 20 years. The Chinese have spent $8 trillion building them.
Let me raise this with you.
Is growing and ours is collapsing.
Mr. Kennedy, let me raise this. There has been this reporting, and I definitely want you to explain this, where there have been media reports trying to paint you as anti-Semite. What do you say to those reports about you and what you said? Please clarify.
Yeah, I mean, I've never made an anti-Semitic statement in my life, ever. And I don't think anybody who is making those charges actually believes that I'm an anti-Semite. In fact, the same people, the sort of the liberal, left-wing liberal establishment, which is calling me an anti-Semite, is also calling me a Zionist. So you tell me how that's possible to be both a Zionist and anti-Semite. I have the best policy on Israel of any Democrat. And listen, Armstrong, for 3 years since the beginning of COVID, they've been able to censor me by removing me from social media platforms and blacking me out in the media. Now that I'm running for president, they can't do that anymore. So they have a new form of censorship, which is to try to discredit me, to marginalize me, to vilify me, to call me names that they know aren't true. They did the same thing to Bernie Sanders. They did the same thing to Tulsi Gabbard. All of the people who get up and say, I want to wind down the war machine, get maligned as anti-Semites, as racist, as pro-Putin or tools of Putin, and they're going to come after me and say that about me next. So prepare yourself. And none of it is true, and they can't point to a single statement I've ever made in my entire life that is anti-Semitic, because I wouldn't do that, because that's not who I am.
What do you say to the media that uses your family members to disparage you, and the Democratic Party who says there's no major endorsement to Robert F. Kennedy running for president? And it doesn't really matter, because what matters most to you is that everyday people who you've given an energy, enthusiasm, an alternative to the Democratic establishment in this upcoming presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, I love my family, but I don't agree with them on everything. And I don't, I think there's a lot of Americans who don't have 100% agreement with their families. I don't agree with them on many family members on the war, on censorship. I have 5 of my family members who are working for the Biden administration, and other ones that are working in, with 501c3s that are engaged in, essentially business with the Biden administration. So I'm not, I love my family, and they have their right to their opinions. I don't think those, are under normal conditions would be family disputes like that would be newsworthy. But I think at this point, the media, the corporate-owned media, throws everything at me that they can to make sure that people are not listening to my arguments, not listening to my facts, but are instead making judgments about me to silence me.
What are your thoughts on these issues of affirmative action and race and transgenderism and critical race theory?
Well, I mean, we got to take one of those at a time. I've said this at the beginning, that I don't think that people who were born male should be able to compete in consequential women's sports. So I'm not talking about intramural sports or, a backyard a football game or pole, or volleyball or whatever. But if you're, my uncle Ted Kennedy was the author of Title IX, and I watched him push that through for a decade before he got it through to make sure to give a chance to women's sports to flourish, where they were prejudiced against on the college campuses. I have Armstrong. I have a niece, my wife Cheryl's niece, who is at BC right now on a full scholarship for softball. Well, when she was growing up, she didn't come on vacations with us. She didn't come to the Cape. She didn't come ski vacation in the winter because she was, practicing her craft and trying to get good at it because she wanted to go to college. Her family didn't have enough money to pay for it. And she knew that her path to college was through women's sports. Well, it would be criminal, in my view, if a boy walks off a neighboring baseball field and steps onto her field and takes her place away because he has biological advantages, in height and weight and other biological advantages that makes him, that gives him an advantage, an unfair advantage. Anybody who's transgender or makes difficult choices or about their lives, they deserve to be treated with compassion and respect and dignity. But, on this issue, I would say that, I just don't see that it makes sense.
In critical race theory?
Well, critical race theory, I certainly would not, have a blanket imposition of that interpretation of history in every school. I think, it's important for every nation to recognize, and the United States, that we've had a problematical history, that began with the genocide of the American Indians, the slavery of millions of imported blacks, and that was part of our history. But there's other parts of our history too, and our American history is like the histories of other nations, is made up of light and darkness. And that, I'm glad that when I was a kid that I got, I fell in love with our country because I was taught, the aspirational parts of our history, and I learned. It's important to learn and recognize those other parts as well. But I don't think something that just stresses the worst parts of American history is something that we ought to impose nationally or statewide on school children. That's the only thing that they're going to hear. That doesn't make any sense to me.
You talked about debating Biden. We know he's not going to debate you. And also, Ron DeSantis recently reported your name as head of the FDA or CDC. Any thoughts on the debate and Ron DeSantis already finding a position for you if he's elected?
I think we should have a debate. I think, there's so many people, Armstrong, in our country now who feel like the system is rigged against them, that the election system is rigged, and that the entire economic system is rigged. And, I think both political parties have an obligation to not only the American citizens, but the rest of the world, because we're the model democracy on earth. We have an obligation to model elections that are actually democratic, where, it's not like the old Soviet Union where the political party picks the nominees and the election is just a kabuki theater of democracy. It's not real democracy. I think it's good to give people a choice. It's good to have, people actually campaigning in New Hampshire, to visiting the nail salons and the barber shops and the diners and the gas stations, and being forced, the national political candidates are forced to go to town halls and meet real people and not just do these phony rallies where they carpet bomb the states with advertising that they get, from borrowing money from billionaires, and then dropping in for a staged rally every once in a while. That we ought to have real democracy with a lot of people running, and people, the American people actually being allowed to make choices and not, being chosen by the political party. So that would be my hope.
You know, much respect for your love for this country. You're wanting to run and making the sacrifices with the attacks, people creating a person that you don't even recognize and calling them Robert Kennedy Jr. And I really appreciate your sitting down with us today to answer the tough questions and being sincere. And we look forward to having you in our broadcast house. And again, we wish you well. Your family has sacrificed so much for the continued greatness of this country. We appreciate you and the legacy that you're building. And thank you again for joining us for this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show.